By the end, he had outlived almost all of them. Benjamin Siegel was the first to go. Shot through the window of a Beverly Hills living room on the evening of June 20th, 1947, the bullets finding him where he sat on a sofa reading the newspaper. He was 41 years old. The men who ordered it, whoever they were, had their reasons, and those reasons have been debated for 70 years without resolution. What is not debated is the fact itself. Siegel was gone, and Lansky, who had known him since they were boys playing dice on the sidewalks of the Lower East Side, who had built something with him that neither could have built alone, received the news and did what he always did. He absorbed it. He continued. This was not a small thing, the absorbing. It requires a particular kind of discipline to receive the news that someone you have known since childhood, someone who was present at the formation of everything you built, has been killed, and to continue. Not to perform continuity, not to force yourself through the motions of ordinary life while something underneath collapses, but to actually continue, to redirect the attention back to the work, to maintain the systems and the relationships and the forward motion of an operation that does not pause for grief. Lansky had that discipline. He had needed it before. He would need it again. Lucky Luciano died in Naples in January of 1962 of a heart attack at the airport on his way to meet an American filmmaker who wanted to tell his story. He was 64. He had spent his final years in Italian exile, deported from the United States in 1946, as part of an arrangement whose details were murky and whose implications were considerable. He and Lansky had spoken by phone, occasionally met in Europe during Lansky's travels, maintained the thread of a relationship that had begun in the same streets and the same era, and had shaped the architecture of American organized crime as thoroughly as any single alliance in its history. With Luciano gone, the last of the original triumvirate had fallen. What remained was Lansky. Older, quieter, walking his dog along Collins Avenue in the Miami Beach mornings while men in parked cars took his photograph. He had outlived his world. The question was what that meant. The men who built the National Crime Syndicate in the late 1920s and early 1930s had understood something that most of their predecessors had not. That organized crime, to be durable, had to function like a business, not a gang, not a collection of violent individuals competing for the same territory. A business. With division of labor, internal discipline, dispute resolution mechanisms, and the kind of long-term strategic thinking that kept short-term conflicts from destroying long-term value. Lansky had been central to that understanding. He had provided, across decades of operation, the financial sophistication that gave the organization its durability. He understood that money needed to move. That static wealth was visible wealth, and visible wealth was vulnerable wealth. He understood that the relationship between criminal income and legitimate financial systems was not a wall to be broken through, but a maze to be navigated carefully by someone who had taken the time to learn its geometry. And he had outlived the men who depended on that understanding. The men who built the National Crime Syndicate had understood something most of their predecessors had not. Lansky had outlived every one of them, and he remembered everything. What happened to the organization after the deaths of Siegel and Luciano, and after the subsequent deaths through the 1960s and 1970s of the men who had surrounded them, was not a collapse but a transformation. The structures remained. New men came up through the hierarchies and took positions of authority. But they had not built what they inherited. They were operating a machine whose engineering they did not fully understand. Lansky understood it. He had been in the room where most of the key decisions were made, or he had known the men who were. He carried in his memory, in the careful, precise memory that allowed him to run numbers in his head while other boys reached for pencils, a map of something that no longer existed in the form he had helped create, the offshore architecture, the relationships with Swiss bankers and Bahamian lawyers, the agreements and accommodations reached in back rooms and hotel suites across 4 decades of operation. He remembered all of it with the fidelity of someone who had understood, from the beginning, that memory was itself a form of power. Perhaps the most durable form, since it could not be seized, could not be subpoenaed, and would expire only when he did. But the men who might have testified to that map were gone. This was, From the perspective of the federal investigators who spent the late 1960s and 1970s attempting to construct cases against Lansky, one of the central structural obstacles they faced. A prosecution requires witnesses. Witnesses require two things: knowledge of the relevant facts and willingness to testify to them. The men who had the most comprehensive knowledge of Lansky's role were dead. The men who were alive and knew something substantial were unwilling to testify, for reasons that included, in several cases, a well-founded understanding of what happened to people who testified against the wrong interests. The result was a peculiar kind of isolation. Lansky existed at the center of an enormous amount of institutional knowledge held by law enforcement, by journalists, by former associates who would speak off the record, but not on it. And yet that knowledge could not be translated into legal accountability. He was, in the language of the investigators who spent their careers on him, the most documented man they could not convict. The witnesses kept dying. The cases kept collapsing. And Lansky kept walking his dog. There is a temptation, in retrospect, to read this as strategy, to assume that Lansky had arranged things so that the witnesses would not be available when the moment came. This is not the conclusion that the available evidence supports. The deaths of Siegel, Luciano, and the others were not convenient for Lansky in any tactical sense. They removed men he had worked with, depended on, and in Siegel's case genuinely mourned. What they also removed, incidentally, was the most dangerous testimony that could have been brought against him. But this was a consequence, not a design. The design, insofar as there was one, was structural rather than personal. Lansky had built his role in the organization in such a way that his involvement was real, but his fingerprints were minimal. He understood the system of legal accountability, what it required, what it could not reach, and where the gap between the two could be made large enough to be durable. That gap had kept him free while the men around him fell. The Israel episode of 1970 was the moment when his isolation became most visible, when the man who had always operated within a web of relationships found himself genuinely alone in a way he had not been before. He traveled invoking the law of return, which granted automatic citizenship to individuals of Jewish heritage, and the Israeli Supreme Court turned him away. He had no powerful friend who could intervene. The men who might have provided that kind of leverage were gone. He flew home to face the charges accumulating in his absence, returning not in triumph but with the particular dignity of someone who had run out of alternatives and accepted that fact without drama. And the charges fell apart, not because of his power or his connections. They fell apart because the witnesses were dead or silent, because the evidence was insufficient, because the offshore architecture that had made his operation so difficult to trace also made direct attribution nearly impossible. In 1973, the primary conspiracy case was dismissed. The government's 4-decade pursuit ended not with a conviction, but with a series of procedural failures that left the case permanently unresolved. He returned to his apartment. He walked his dog. The FBI was still watching. There was simply nothing left to find. What they were watching by the mid-1970s was an old man in diminishing health who had outlived his entire world, the National Crime Syndicate. The back rooms and the offshore accounts and the casino floors had contracted over the years to the dimensions of a modest apartment on a regular street and a routine of almost suburban simplicity. He had been the last witness to something enormous, and he carried what he knew with the same discipline he had applied to everything else, completely, precisely, and without any visible sign of the weight it represented. There were journalists who requested interviews. There were investigators who tried, in informal conversations, to draw him out. There were researchers who believed that what Lansky knew about the financial architecture of mid-century American organized crime was simply irreplaceable, that no document, no wiretap, no confession from a lesser figure could substitute for what he held in memory. He gave them nothing, not defensively, simply with the same calm, watchful silence that had characterized him since he was a boy standing at the edge of a dice game on a Lower East Side sidewalk, watching how the numbers moved and saying nothing about what he saw. His son Paul, who had been born with cerebral palsy and required ongoing care, was a consistent presence in his final years. By all credible accounts, Lansky was genuinely and attentively present in that relationship. Not a distracted patriarch managing obligations from a distance, but a father who spent real time, who worried, who made careful arrangements for his care. He was, in this dimension of his life, simply a father, not a financial architect, not the subject of a federal investigation, not the last surviving member of a generation that had built something history would spend decades trying to understand. Just a man with a son who needed him, doing what fathers do. It is a detail that resists easy interpretation, not because it redeems anything, but because it is human, and the last witness to the construction of the American underworld was, finally, a human being whose world had contracted to a dog, a diner, a son who needed him, and the long memory of everything he would never speak. When Lansky died in January of 1983, investigators went through his papers. They found $57,000, whatever map he carried. He took it with him. Siegel shot through a window in 1947. Luciano fallen at a Naples airport in 1962. The builders, the architects, the men who had understood that the opportunity was organizational, gone, one by one, across the decades. Their names in the newspapers. Their names in the court records. Their names, in some cases, on headstones in cities they had once helped control. What remained was the silence. And in that silence, the outline of something that could be intuited but never fully proven. An architecture of relationships and financial structures built by men who were no longer alive to describe it, and remembered in full by one man who had decided, long ago and for reasons he never explained, that he would carry it to the end alone. He had outlived all of them. He had said nothing. And now he too was gone. There is one final thing worth noting. Lansky was not a symbol. He was not an abstraction. He was a man who had come to America as a child with nothing, who had found in the streets of the Lower East Side a particular kind of education that no school was offering, and who had applied everything that education gave him. The mathematics, the systems thinking, the patient reading of rooms and people and situations. To the construction of a life that the law spent 4 decades trying to dismantle without success. Whether that represents something to admire is a question each person must answer for themselves. What it represents, at minimum, is something to understand. The silence was his last and most complete achievement.